The most unforgettable people rarely announce who they are. Sometimes they simply say hello, and the entire room discovers how little it truly knows. On a cool autumn evening overlooking Seattle's shimmering waterfront, the private dining hall of Romano House welcomed some of the most influential guests in the city. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors while a string quartet filled the air with elegant music. Every table had been arranged with perfect precision, every glass gleamed beneath soft golden light, and every member of the staff moved with practiced confidence. Tonight was not simply another exclusive gathering. It was the 75th birthday celebration of Vincent Romano, the respected father of one of the most powerful Korean Mafia bosses in the Pacific Northwest. Although his son, Adrian Romano, rarely attended public celebrations, everyone understood that this evening was different. It was the one night each year when business was forgotten, traditions mattered more than influence, and family stood above everything else. Among dozens of experienced servers quietly preparing the final details was 28-year-old Emily Carter, a waitress whom almost nobody noticed. She wore the same elegant black uniform as every other member of the restaurant staff, her dark hair neatly gathered behind her shoulders, and her calm expression revealed neither nervousness nor excitement. To the guests, she was simply another young woman carrying polished silver trays between beautifully decorated tables. They had no reason to imagine that she would soon become the only person anyone remembered from the evening. The restaurant manager quietly reminded every employee that Mr. Romano appreciated respect above luxury. Every greeting had to be formal. Every movement had to be graceful. Every mistake would be remembered. Emily simply nodded before carefully lifting a porcelain teapot with both hands. Her breathing remained slow and steady as though this assignment were no different from any other shift she had worked. Across the room, Vincent Romano finally entered with measured steps, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His silver hair reflected the warm chandelier light, and although age had softened his features, his quiet presence immediately commanded respect. Every guest stood. Conversations disappeared almost instantly. Even the musicians lowered their volume as Vincent acknowledged the room with a humble smile before taking his seat at the center table. A few moments later, Emily approached carrying the first pot of premium green tea. Every movement reflected patience rather than performance. She gently placed the teacup before Vincent, poured the steaming tea without spilling a single drop, then lowered her head with sincere respect. What happened next lasted no more than a few seconds, yet everyone present would remember it for years. Instead of offering the standard greeting expected from every employee, Emily spoke softly in an old regional Korean dialect that had nearly disappeared from everyday conversation. Her pronunciation carried remarkable authenticity, her tone conveyed deep traditional respect, and every syllable sounded as though it belonged to another generation. The teacup stopped halfway to Vincent's lips. His eyes widened ever so slightly before slowly lifting toward the young waitress standing beside him. Around the room, puzzled expressions spread from table to table. A few Korean guests exchanged confused glances, recognizing fragments of the dialect but struggling to understand every word. Others simply sensed that something extraordinary had just happened. The music continued, but nobody seemed to hear it anymore. Every conversation faded into complete silence as Vincent Romano continued looking at Emily with an expression no one in the room had ever seen before. It was not surprise alone. It was recognition. Somewhere beneath decades of success, responsibility, and carefully guarded memories, one forgotten piece of home had quietly found its way back to him through the voice of a waitress whom everyone else had overlooked. The silence lingered far longer than anyone expected. It was not the uncomfortable silence that follows an awkward mistake, nor the tense quiet that arrives before an argument. It was the kind of silence created when an entire room suddenly realizes it has witnessed something it cannot immediately explain. Vincent Romano slowly lowered the teacup back onto its delicate saucer without taking a single sip. His eyes never left Emily Carter. For several heartbeats neither of them spoke. The other servers remained perfectly still, uncertain whether they should continue serving the remaining guests or wait for instructions. Even the restaurant manager, who had spent years overseeing exclusive private events, could not decide whether to intervene. Across the dining hall, whispered conversations began spreading from one table to another. Some guests assumed the waitress had simply memorized a few traditional Korean phrases to impress an important customer. Others quietly insisted that her pronunciation had sounded far too authentic for someone who had learned from books or online videos. A distinguished businessman from Los Angeles leaned toward his wife and quietly admitted that even he could not recognize every expression she had used. Another guest from Seoul frowned thoughtfully before saying that the greeting sounded older than anything he had heard growing up. The uncertainty only deepened the mystery. Emily remained composed. She neither smiled proudly nor appeared nervous. She simply offered a respectful bow before preparing to step away, believing her responsibility had ended with serving the tea. Before she could take another step, Vincent spoke softly. "Young lady." His voice carried neither authority nor suspicion. It carried curiosity. Emily immediately turned back with the same calm expression. "Yes, sir?" Vincent studied her face for another moment. "Where did you learn to greet someone like that?" The question floated gently through the room, and every nearby conversation disappeared once again. Emily answered without hesitation. "From people who believed respect should never become old-fashioned." Her response surprised everyone because it avoided explaining anything while somehow sounding completely sincere. Vincent's expression softened almost imperceptibly. For the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. It was small enough that most people missed it, but one person did not. Standing near the entrance surrounded by several trusted associates, Adrian Romano had quietly arrived moments earlier. He had entered without ceremony, as he usually preferred, expecting to observe the celebration from a distance before greeting his father privately. Instead, he found every guest staring toward an ordinary waitress. Adrian followed their gaze until his eyes settled on Emily. She looked exactly like every other member of the serving staff. There were no expensive clothes, no dramatic entrance, no attempt to attract attention. Yet his father, a man whose emotions rarely escaped public view, was looking at her with unmistakable interest. Adrian frowned slightly. Something did not fit. Vincent finally lifted the teacup and took a slow sip before speaking again. "It has been many years since I heard those words spoken exactly that way." Emily lowered her eyes respectfully. "Some memories deserve to be preserved, sir." The simplicity of her answer somehow carried more weight than a lengthy explanation ever could. Around the room, several guests exchanged increasingly puzzled glances. They had arrived expecting an evening of refined conversation, celebrated cuisine, and influential company. Instead, an unknown waitress had become the quiet center of everyone's attention without asking for it. Adrian continued watching from across the room. He had spent his entire adult life learning to recognize confidence, deception, ambition, and fear within seconds of meeting someone. Yet the young woman standing beside his father's table displayed none of those qualities. She carried only quiet humility, and somehow that unsettled him more than anything else. For reasons he could not yet understand, Adrian found himself wondering whether the most important guest at his father's birthday celebration had never appeared on the invitation list at all. The most remarkable stories are rarely hidden behind locked doors. More often, they are quietly carried inside ordinary people who never think anyone will ask where they came from. Emily Carter returned to serving the remaining guests as though nothing unusual had happened. She refilled glasses, cleared empty plates, and thanked every visitor with the same gentle professionalism she had shown since the beginning of the evening. Yet the atmosphere around her had changed completely. Conversations resumed, but they never drifted very far before someone glanced toward the young waitress again. She seemed entirely unaware that she had become the evening's greatest mystery. Adrian Romano remained near the entrance, observing without interruption. Years of responsibility had taught him to study people before speaking to them. Confidence often announced itself through posture. Deception usually revealed itself through impatience. Pride almost always searched for attention. Emily displayed none of those qualities. She worked with quiet consistency, never lingering near influential guests, never attempting to continue the conversation with his father, and never behaving as though she expected recognition. That unsettled Adrian even more. A person capable of earning his father's respect so effortlessly should have been eager to enjoy the attention. Instead, she seemed determined to disappear back into the rhythm of her work. At another table, two elderly Korean guests quietly discussed the greeting they had heard only minutes earlier. One admitted that the pronunciation reminded him of stories his own grandmother used to tell during childhood. The other slowly nodded and whispered that the expressions sounded as though they belonged to a small village from decades ago rather than modern Seoul. Their conversation reached the ears of a nearby server, who later shared the rumor with another employee in the kitchen. Before long, quiet curiosity spread throughout the restaurant staff as naturally as the aroma of fresh tea. Emily remained completely unaware of the growing speculation because her thoughts had already drifted somewhere far from Seattle. As she carefully folded a linen napkin, an old memory quietly surfaced. She remembered a modest wooden house surrounded by green hills, where summer afternoons carried the scent of pine trees and fresh rice. She remembered sitting beside an elderly Korean woman who insisted that every greeting carried a piece of the speaker's heart. The woman had gently corrected every syllable until Emily could pronounce each word with patience rather than speed. Years later, those lessons had become less about language and more about respect. The elderly couple who had welcomed her into their family never cared whether she sounded perfect. They cared that every greeting came from sincerity. They often smiled and reminded her that words spoken with genuine respect could travel farther than wealth or influence ever could. Those memories had never seemed extraordinary to Emily. They were simply part of the life she had known growing up after being welcomed into a loving Korean-American household following the loss of her parents at a young age. She had celebrated traditional holidays, listened to stories about villages few people remembered, and learned regional expressions long before she understood they were becoming increasingly rare. None of it had ever felt unusual until strangers began staring at her as though she had revealed a carefully guarded secret. Across the room, Vincent Romano quietly watched her once again. He recognized something beyond flawless pronunciation. He recognized gratitude expressed through tradition rather than performance. That distinction mattered. Adrian noticed the thoughtful expression on his father's face and realized he had not seen that particular look in many years. It was the expression of a man revisiting a cherished memory instead of attending a formal celebration. Without realizing it, Emily had done something that expensive gifts, influential friendships, and decades of success had never accomplished. She had reminded an elderly man that some parts of home could survive an entire lifetime if even one person chose never to forget them. Respect has a quiet way of inviting questions that pride never thinks to ask. The celebration gradually returned to its elegant rhythm, but something invisible had shifted beneath the polished surface of the evening. The conversation sounded softer now, as though everyone feared speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile memory that had unexpectedly settled over Vincent Romano's table. Waiters continued serving carefully prepared courses, crystal glasses caught the warm glow of the chandeliers, and the quartet gently transitioned into another classical piece, yet every few minutes another guest found an excuse to glance toward Emily Carter. She moved through the dining room with the same calm pace as before, offering warm smiles, replacing silverware, and thanking each table with quiet professionalism. Nothing about her behavior suggested she believed she had done anything remarkable. Adrian Romano watched every detail from across the room. The more he observed, the less he understood. He had expected someone seeking attention to linger near his father after creating such an unforgettable moment. Instead, Emily deliberately kept her distance, treating every guest with identical courtesy regardless of status or influence. There was no performance in her actions, only consistency. That consistency interested him far more than the mysterious greeting itself. Vincent finally set down his teacup and slowly turned toward his son. Their eyes met across the dining hall, and with a subtle motion of his hand, Vincent invited Adrian to join him. Several nearby guests politely stepped aside as Adrian approached the table. He greeted his father warmly before taking the empty chair beside him. For a brief moment neither of them mentioned the unusual exchange that everyone else continued discussing. Instead, Vincent quietly admired the tea resting before him as though it carried memories more valuable than the expensive vintage wines surrounding it. After a thoughtful pause, Adrian spoke in a calm voice. "Father, you seem unusually moved tonight." Vincent smiled gently without looking away from the steaming cup. Some voices carry people back to places they believed they had already left behind. Adrian followed his father's gaze toward Emily, who was carefully helping an elderly couple with fresh dessert plates. "Do you know her?" he asked. Vincent slowly shook his head. "No. But the way she spoke reminded me of someone who taught me my first lessons about respect long before I ever understood success." Adrian remained silent. His father rarely spoke about his childhood. In fact, he almost never spoke about the years before coming to America. Hearing even a small glimpse of those memories immediately captured his attention. Before Adrian could ask another question, Vincent quietly raised one hand toward a nearby server. "Would you please ask Miss Carter if she has a few moments when her duties allow?" The request spread through the staff almost instantly. The restaurant manager personally approached Emily and politely delivered the invitation. For the first time that evening, she appeared slightly surprised. She looked toward Vincent with quiet humility before nodding. "Of course," she answered softly. "As soon as I finish serving this table." Adrian noticed something that impressed him even more than her remarkable language skills. She did not abandon her responsibilities simply because one of the most respected men in the room had requested her presence. She completed every task with the same care she had shown from the beginning of the evening before finally walking toward Vincent's table. Her posture remained relaxed, her expression respectful, and her hands rested calmly before her. As she stopped beside the table, Vincent looked up with genuine warmth instead of formal politeness. The surrounding conversations gradually faded once again. Guests sensed that another unexpected moment was about to unfold, and without anyone asking for silence, the room naturally grew still as an ordinary waitress prepared to share a conversation that would reveal far more than anyone had imagined. Emily Carter stopped beside Vincent Romano's table and offered the same respectful bow she had given every guest that evening. Nothing about her posture suggested she expected praise or attention. She simply waited with quiet patience, allowing the elderly man to speak first. Vincent looked at her with gentle curiosity, the kind reserved for someone who had unexpectedly reopened a treasured memory. "Would you mind sitting with us for just a moment?" he asked. Emily hesitated before politely shaking her head. "Thank you, sir, but I should remain standing while I am working." Vincent smiled with understanding. Another lesson in respect. Adrian Romano noticed that his father sounded less like the honored guest of an exclusive celebration and more like an old friend rediscovering a familiar voice. Around the room, conversation softened once again as nearby guests discreetly listened without pretending they were not interested. Vincent folded his hands together and spoke a short sentence in the same regional Korean dialect Emily had used earlier. The words were gentle and carried the warmth of a distant home. Emily answered immediately in the same dialect, her pronunciation calm and natural, never rushed, never exaggerated. A quiet exchange continued between them for nearly a minute. To most of the room it sounded beautiful but impossible to understand. The unfamiliar rhythm of the old expressions filled the elegant dining hall with a strange feeling of timelessness, as though two generations separated by continents had suddenly found common ground. Adrian watched his father's face transform with every sentence. The guarded expression that usually accompanied years of responsibility slowly disappeared, replaced by genuine joy that no expensive celebration could have purchased. Then an unexpected voice broke the silence. "Excuse me." Everyone turned toward a distinguished gentleman seated several tables away. He introduced himself with quiet humility as Professor Daniel Park, a retired linguistic scholar who had spent more than 30 years studying Korean regional dialects at a respected university in California. The professor smiled warmly before addressing Emily. "Young lady, would you forgive my curiosity? May I ask where you learned to speak that dialect?" Emily answered honestly. "From my grandparents." The professor nodded thoughtfully. "Were they from the southeastern countryside?" Emily smiled softly. Yes, sir. They came to America many years ago, but at home they always spoke exactly that way. They believed every generation should protect the words that carried their family's history. The professor leaned back slowly, clearly impressed. That explains everything. Your pronunciation is not academic. It is lived. It carries the natural rhythm that only comes from hearing it every day. Several Korean guests exchanged astonished glances. Even those who spoke Korean fluently understood what the professor meant. Language learned from textbooks often sounded correct. Language learned around a family dinner table carried warmth that could never be copied. Vincent quietly looked around the room before speaking in English so every guest could understand. Many people believe traditions survive inside museums. They do not. They survive inside ordinary people who choose to remember. His words settled over the dining hall like a gentle breeze. Emily lowered her eyes modestly, clearly uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. I only repeated what my grandparents taught me, she said. They always reminded me that the greatest respect we can offer another person is to remember where they came from. Adrian remained silent, but something inside him had begun to shift. For the first time that evening he realized the remarkable moment had never been about perfect pronunciation. It was about preserving someone else's memories with such sincerity that they felt alive again. Looking at Emily now, he no longer saw an ordinary waitress serving tea. He saw someone carrying an inheritance that money could never purchase and influence could never replace. Vincent Romano rested both hands around the warm porcelain teacup, yet his attention remained entirely on Emily Carter. The quiet dignity she carried reminded him that the most meaningful traditions were never preserved by famous people. They survived because ordinary families refused to let them disappear. The elderly professor gently nodded toward Vincent before returning to his seat, sensing that another story was waiting to be told. Vincent looked around the dining room until every conversation naturally faded away. He was not a man who often spoke about his private life, and those who knew him understood that silence usually protected memories too precious to share. After a thoughtful pause, he smiled softly at Emily. The words you greeted me with were not simply polite. They belonged to my mother. The room became completely still. Even Adrian Romano slowly turned toward his father with quiet surprise. In all his years, he had heard almost nothing about his grandmother beyond a few brief family stories. Vincent continued speaking in a calm voice that carried neither sadness nor regret, only gratitude. She came from a small village in the southeastern countryside of Korea. Every morning she greeted our neighbors with those exact expressions. She believed the way a person welcomed another human being revealed the condition of the heart. He paused for a moment before looking directly at Emily again. After she passed away, I never heard those words spoken naturally again. Not once. Decades passed. The cities changed. Families moved across oceans. Younger generations embraced new ways of speaking. I accepted that those sounds belonged only to memory. Emily listened quietly, her eyes reflecting sincere compassion rather than pride. She understood that this conversation had become far bigger than language itself. Vincent took another slow breath before continuing. Tonight, for just a few seconds, I could almost imagine I was standing in my childhood home again, hearing my mother welcome another guest through our front gate. Several guests quietly lowered their eyes, moved by the unexpected honesty in his voice. Adrian remained completely silent. Watching his father revisit such deeply personal memories revealed a side of the older man he had rarely witnessed. Emily answered gently. My grandmother used to tell me that every old greeting carried the footsteps of those who spoke it before us. She said if we stopped saying those words, we would slowly stop remembering the people who first taught them. Vincent smiled with unmistakable warmth. She was a wise woman. Emily nodded respectfully. She always believed language should make people feel that they belonged, even if they were far from home. Those simple words settled over the room with quiet power. They did not sound rehearsed or philosophical. They sounded like truths repeated so often within one family that they had become part of everyday life. Adrian looked around the elegant dining hall. Many of the guests had arrived wearing expensive watches, tailored suits, and carefully cultivated reputations. Yet none of those things seemed important anymore. The greatest gift offered that evening had come from a young waitress carrying nothing more valuable than the lessons entrusted to her by two loving grandparents. Vincent slowly rose from his chair, not because protocol required it, but because gratitude did. Looking directly at Emily, he placed one hand gently over his heart. "Thank you for bringing a piece of my home back to me." Emily instinctively mirrored the respectful gesture before quietly replying, "Thank you for recognizing it." No applause followed. No dramatic announcement interrupted the silence. There was only a room filled with people who suddenly understood that some treasures could never be measured by wealth, influence, or status. They could only be recognized by hearts willing to remember. Respect changes direction so quietly that most people do not notice the exact moment it happens. Emily Carter offered Vincent Romano one final courteous bow before preparing to return to her responsibilities. She believed the conversation had reached its natural end and that the evening should once again belong to the family celebrating together. Before she could step away, Adrian Romano rose from his chair. The movement immediately caught the attention of every guest nearby because it was unexpected. Throughout the evening he had spoken very little, choosing instead to observe from a distance. He looked toward Emily with calm sincerity rather than authority. "Miss Carter," he said, "you have been standing for most of the night. Please allow yourself a few minutes to rest." Emily blinked in surprise. She instinctively shook her head with a polite smile. "Thank you very much, sir, but I still have tables to serve." Adrian glanced toward the restaurant manager. Before he could say anything, the manager immediately stepped forward with an understanding smile. "We have everything covered for a few minutes. Please do not worry." Emily hesitated. She had never accepted special treatment during any shift, and she had no desire to begin now. Vincent noticed her uncertainty and gently smiled. Sometimes accepting kindness is another way of honoring the people who offer it. After a brief pause, Emily nodded with quiet gratitude and accepted the invitation. Adrian personally pulled out an empty chair near the family table before stepping aside so she could sit comfortably. The simple gesture lasted only a few seconds, yet its meaning reached every corner of the dining room. Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances. Earlier that evening they had barely noticed the young waitress moving silently between tables. Now the son of the guest of honor had chosen to treat her with the same respect he extended to distinguished visitors and lifelong family friends. No announcement explained the moment. No speech was necessary. The gesture spoke clearly enough on its own. Nearby servers paused briefly before returning to their work with renewed smiles. Even the restaurant manager seemed quietly proud that someone wearing his staff uniform had earned such genuine admiration through nothing more than humility and character. Adrian sat across from Emily, studying her with open curiosity instead of suspicion. "May I ask you something?" he said. Emily nodded. "Of course." Adrian folded his hands together. "You could have mentioned your background the moment my father asked where you learned that dialect. Most people would have enjoyed surprising the room." Emily smiled gently before looking down at the teacup resting in front of her. "My grandparents never taught me those words so people would admire me. They taught me because they believed respect loses its value the moment it becomes a performance." Adrian quietly reflected on her answer. It sounded remarkably simple, yet he realized how rarely he had encountered someone who truly lived by those principles. Emily continued softly. "They always reminded me that if a tradition is beautiful, it does not need applause. It only needs someone willing to keep practicing it." Vincent slowly nodded, clearly recognizing the wisdom behind those words. Around the dining hall, the atmosphere felt noticeably different than it had at the beginning of the celebration. Expensive clothing, important titles, and influential reputations no longer seemed to define the evening. Instead, the quiet center of attention had become a young woman whose greatest accomplishment was remembering lessons that many others had forgotten. Adrian looked around the room before returning his attention to Emily. In that moment he understood something his father had known long before success ever entered their lives. True dignity never asks to be noticed. It simply remains faithful to who it is until everyone else finally learns to notice it. The greatest moments of justice rarely arrive with raised voices or public humiliation. They arrive when people quietly choose to see another human being differently than they did only an hour before. Emily Carter thanked Adrian Romano and Vincent Romano for their kindness before gently standing from her chair. She offered another respectful bow, then returned to her duties without expecting anything else from the evening. As she resumed serving coffee and dessert, something remarkable began unfolding throughout the dining hall. Guests who had barely acknowledged her earlier now greeted her with warm smiles. Several stood slightly as she approached their tables, thanking her not only for the excellent service but also for reminding everyone that traditions carried far more value than appearances. The atmosphere had become lighter, warmer, almost as though the elegant room itself had exhaled after holding its breath for years. Near the center of the dining hall, the restaurant manager quietly approached Emily while she carefully arranged fresh cups beside a dessert tray. He paused for a brief moment before speaking. "Miss Carter, may I have a word?" Emily immediately nodded. "Of course." The manager lowered his voice. "I owe you an apology." Emily looked genuinely surprised. Throughout her months at the restaurant, he had always been professional, although often demanding during busy evenings. He continued with visible sincerity. "There were times when I corrected you too quickly because I believed perfection only came from strict supervision. Tonight I realized something important. Professional excellence can be taught. Character cannot. You brought something into this room that none of us could have prepared, and I almost overlooked the person who carried it." Emily smiled gently, her expression free from resentment. "You were only trying to help the restaurant succeed." The manager slowly shook his head. "Success means very little if we forget to appreciate the people who make it meaningful." Without another word, he extended his hand. Emily accepted the handshake with quiet gratitude, and several nearby employees smiled as they witnessed the simple exchange. No audience had been invited. No announcement interrupted the celebration. Yet that brief moment seemed every bit as meaningful as the elegant speeches delivered earlier in the evening. Across the room, a distinguished business executive who had initially dismissed Emily as an ordinary server approached her table while waiting for his coat. He smiled with genuine humility. "Miss Carter, I would like to thank you." Emily answered politely. "You are very kind, sir." The gentleman shook his head. "No. I arrived believing I would remember the food, the music, and the guest list. Instead, I will remember your grandparents, even though I never had the privilege of meeting them. Somehow their kindness reached all of us through you." Emily's eyes softened. "I think they would have been happy to hear that." Adrian quietly observed these conversations from beside his father. Earlier that evening, respect had flowed almost entirely toward those with influence, wealth, and established reputations. Now he watched accomplished executives, scholars, community leaders, and longtime family friends patiently waiting for an opportunity to thank a waitress who had never once asked to become the center of attention. Vincent noticed the thoughtful expression on his son's face and gently smiled. "Do you see it now?" Adrian nodded slowly. "Yes." Vincent looked across the room toward Emily, who was once again pouring tea with the same quiet care she had shown from the beginning of the evening. "Real honor is never demanded," he said softly. "It is invited by the way a person chooses to live every ordinary day." Adrian followed his father's gaze and realized that nothing about Emily had changed since the celebration began. The only thing that had changed was the way everyone else had finally learned to see her. The evening slowly drew to a close, but no one seemed eager to leave. Outside the towering windows, the lights of Seattle shimmered across the calm water, reflecting like scattered stars beneath the quiet night sky. Inside the dining hall, the final cups of tea were poured, the last conversations became softer, and the celebration settled into the peaceful warmth that only meaningful memories could create. Emily Carter continued clearing the tables with the same quiet grace she had shown from the beginning of the evening. If someone had walked into the restaurant at that moment, they never would have guessed that she had become the heart of the celebration. She carried empty plates, thanked departing guests, and wished every family a pleasant evening with exactly the same sincerity she had offered hours earlier. Nothing about her suggested she believed she had accomplished anything extraordinary. Vincent Romano remained seated for a few moments after most of the guests had departed. He watched Emily carefully fold a white linen napkin before placing it neatly onto a serving cart. Finally, he stood and slowly walked toward her. Adrian followed a few steps behind, choosing not to interrupt. Emily noticed them approaching and immediately offered another respectful bow. Vincent smiled warmly before speaking. "Miss Carter, before we leave, I have one final request." Emily nodded politely. "Of course, sir." Vincent gently lifted the small porcelain teacup he had used throughout the evening and handed it toward her. "Would you pour one last cup of tea for me?" Emily accepted the cup with both hands, prepared fresh green tea exactly as she had done earlier, and carefully returned it without spilling a single drop. Vincent received the cup with quiet appreciation before looking into her eyes. "And would you greet me once more?" Emily understood immediately. She lowered her head with heartfelt respect and softly spoke the same traditional regional greeting that had welcomed him back to his childhood only hours before. The familiar words floated gently through the nearly empty dining hall, carrying no desire to impress anyone because there was no audience left to impress. They existed only as an expression of gratitude between two people who understood what they meant. Vincent closed his eyes briefly as he listened. When Emily finished speaking, he answered her in the same dialect, his voice steady, warm, and filled with peace. For one quiet moment, age, distance, and decades seemed to disappear. There was only memory, respect, and the comforting feeling that home was never truly lost as long as someone still remembered how to welcome another person with kindness. Adrian watched the exchange in complete silence. He realized that every lesson his father had tried to teach him about honor, humility, and family had suddenly become visible through the actions of someone who possessed neither wealth nor influence. Emily returned the gentle smile they offered her and quietly said, "Thank you for allowing me to honor the people who taught me those words." Vincent placed one hand over his heart once more. "No, Miss Carter. Tonight you honored far more than my family. You reminded every person in this room that respect is never measured by a title, a fortune, or a reputation. It is measured by the kindness we choose to carry into the lives of others." Emily simply bowed one final time before returning to her work as though the evening had been perfectly ordinary. Vincent and Adrian walked toward the exit together, but before stepping outside, Adrian looked back one last time. Emily was already preparing the dining room for the next day's guests with the same quiet dedication that had defined every moment of the evening. She had not changed because the world had finally noticed her. The world had changed because it finally noticed the dignity she had carried all along. And that night, everyone who walked out beneath the Seattle skyline carried home the same unforgettable lesson. The greatest legacy a person can leave behind is not power or success. It is making another human being feel remembered.